Have you heard of the Tree Man? My older brothers used to tell stories about him late at night. They were all variations of the same basic tale. You're wandering through the woods in the dark when, suddenly, you realize that you're being watched. You look up, and you see the fuzzy silhouette of a man in a tree looking at you. You try to run, but instead you find yourself drawn to this tree. In the morning, the only sign you were ever there is a streak of blood running down its trunk. What can I say? My brothers were not very creative. The truth is, the Tree Man doesn't come out only at night. Sometimes he shows up in the broad daylight, because the whole point is that you can see him. The Tree Man doesn't limit himself to remote forests either. He will show up in just about any tree, even in the middle of a bustling city, as long as it's an evergreen. Deciduous forests that lose their leaves just don't work for him. Some people believe that the Tree Man is malicious, but that's really not true. There is no invisible force that brings you to him, and he has no intention of devouring you. He just likes to watch. But he also likes to watch you watching him. I suppose he is a sort of an exhibitionist. I first encountered the Tree Man over 20 years ago. At the time, I was a lonely teenager, taking an annual trip with my family to our summer lake house. Before you say anything, no, we're not rich. The house was merely an uninsulated one-room cabin off a dirt road, but it had just enough space for all of us to sleep on the floor. I used to hate those trips. Without the distraction of school or work, my brothers spent all of their free time scaring me with increasingly dangerous pranks. They hid under the house and pounded on the floorboards when I tried to sleep. They put dead flies in my food, and then they pretended to chop off my fingers with an axe. The only escape from my brother's torment was the solitude of the lake's single island. When no one was paying attention, I would grab a bag of snacks and my favorite book, sit off in our only canoe, and paddle into the middle of the lake. The island itself was tiny, as was everything on it. On one end was a small boulder, half submerged in the water, and on the other end was a beach with just enough space to pull up a boat. There was a patch of blueberry bushes and a handful of sickly trees. The one exception was a solitary pine that towered over the island, casting half of its shadow during the day. I spent hours reading underneath the shadow of that tree. Sometimes my brothers would just see me out there all alone and yell for me to come back, but I just ignored them. On the weekends, other vacationers would come to the island with their families and bring their picnic baskets. Whenever I heard them approach in a rumbling motorboat, I would climb into the lower branches of the pine tree and continue to read, unnoticed. One day, a particularly large family with at least 4 children arrived on the island. The adults set up beach chairs and drank beer while the kids splashed in the water. As usual, I climbed the tree and I tried to ignore them. After about an hour, they were packing up to leave when the youngest girl, no more than 2 years old, just started to scream, "There's a man in the tree!" Her parents rushed over to see what she was talking about, and as she pointed up at me, I remember tensing my muscles and willing myself to freeze, afraid that the adults would be angry with me for spying on their family. Her parents looked up, but apparently they could not see me through the foliage, because they dragged the girl onto the boat and left while scolding her for making up so many stories. As soon as they were gone, I breathed a sigh of relief and I relaxed. That was when I heard the rustling of branches above me. I looked up and I saw him sitting there, his face angled towards me, eyes open and unblinking. He was just a regular man, somewhere between the ages of 30 and 50, dressed in a striped polo shirt and khaki shorts. He didn't have bark for skin or leaves growing out of his hands. He smiled as he lazily kicked his flip-flops back and forth. The Tree Man patted the branch next to him and motioned for me to come up. Warily, I climbed up until I was sitting beside him, leaning against the trunk. He gestured outward and my heart skipped a beat. I was no longer looking out at the lake. but instead, I was gazing into the window of my family's cabin. My brothers were roughhousing in the middle of the floor, and my mother was starting a fire in the wood-burning stove. Once I got my breathing under control, I turned my head in every direction. I appeared to be sitting in a recognizable tree in front of our cabin. Everything was where it should have been, except for me. None of this should have been possible, but it was happening anyways. The tree man was still kicking his legs beside me, smiling. He snapped a pine cone off a branch and he chucked it at the window. It bounced off with a loud thud, and one of my brothers went to the glass and looked out. He locked eyes with me and his face went white. The tree man patted me on the shoulder and he whispered, "Have fun." And then he started to climb down. As soon as his feet touched the branch below me, he vanished. I panicked and I fell backwards, grabbing onto another branch. The world seemed to blur and swirl around the tree before refocusing into a mountainous landscape. I let go and I dropped on another branch. Suddenly, I was gazing out over a massive harbor, straddled by a heavily trafficked suspension bridge. I closed my eyes and I climbed down until I felt solid ground under my feet. When I opened my eyes again, I was back on the island. The tree man was paddling away in a kayak. It must have been hidden in the bushes because I didn't notice it when I first arrived. He turned and he waved. I stood with my mouth hanging open and watched as he landed on the shore, pulled up his boat, and he strolled into his house. I never saw the tree man again, and I didn't try to find him at his home either. I was too far busy experimenting with the pine tree that summer. I discovered that each branch above a certain height brought me to a different place. My exact position on a branch allowed me to cycle through all of the evergreen trees in that area. I read my books with everything from downtown Vanilla to the redwood forests of Northern California in the background. Although I was never able to identify every place I went, most forests looked the same. Eventually, I decided to heed the tree man's advice and have some fun. I started sneaking out to the island after dark and appearing to my brothers one at a time. I rustled branches maniacally, dropping pine cones on their head, and I made sure they clearly saw that I was a person, although I didn't think they ever recognized me. Maybe they just didn't want to believe their eyes. In the following weeks, the pranking and tormenting tapered off and was replaced by scary stories. The first time my brothers described the tree man, I was barely able to stifle a laugh. They told the story as if it was a regional legend that would frighten me, but I could tell that they were trying to hide their own fear. Sometimes they said that the tree man had blood leaking from his eyes, and other times they claimed that he called down banshees and ghosts to attack his victims. I just sat and listened to their exaggerations with silent amusement. As I got older and my brothers grew more mature, I used the pine tree less and less. Eventually, we stopped going on family vacations every summer and we started families of our own. But I still went back to that tree by myself every few years. I used it to appear to my brothers for a split second wherever they lived, just to remind them that the tree man was still watching them and that he would be watching them forever. As far as I know, they have not tormented their own children the way that they tormented me. And it doesn't matter if they don't believe me, because the tree man is gone now. I'm currently writing this from my family's cabin. I came to the lake this autumn and found that the pine tree on the island was brown and empty. The pine needles had fallen to the ground and the branches were brittle and dead. I wish I knew what happened, but I doubt there is any great mystery. Everything dies eventually. Before I leave, I'm planning to paddle out to the island one last time. I'm going to pick up a pine cone from under the tree's emaciated shadow and bury it. Maybe someday, a new tree will grow in its place, fed by the decaying trunk of its parent. Perhaps a child will hide from his family in its branches. If you have ever caught a glimpse of the tree man sitting in a particularly tall pine tree at the end of your street, just remember that he wasn't there for you. Unless he was, in which this case, you know who you are.